So hello, everybody. I am here with Owen Cyclops. Owen Cyclops is an artist who does illustrations that use a lot of symbolism, a lot of Christian symbolism, a lot of weird symbolism. And I encountered him on Twitter, and I was so impressed by his work that I decided to commission him an image based on the Watch the Fools theme in my videos, the notion that the fool is also there to flip things when things are chaotic, to bring the king back, let's say, to bring order back when the world is upside down. And so we just finished this image last week. I put it on some merch and I'm putting it out there as this video is playing. And so I'm really excited to talk to Owen to figure out about his own journey through art, through symbolism, also through religious ideas, and get a sense how we connect. This is Jonathan Pajot. Welcome to the Symbolic World. And so, Owen, maybe you can give us a bit of a sense of your journey, about your work and kind of where you get your inspiration and where you feel like you're going right now.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. Well, basically, in a nutshell, I guess you could say my kind of path, my artistic path, spiritual also, I guess those are kind of the same thing for me, actually, would be that I was pretty much I've always been into religion, mysticism, and things like that. But I would describe myself previously as kind of like the caricature of white guy in his 20s, really into like psychedelics and vaguely Eastern stuff, and maybe seeing myself on kind of like a faux shamanic or like Western occult path. So I really lived in that world for a really long time. I was really into Buddhism, Western occult, and was kind of just floating for a really, really long time. And eventually I became Christian, probably like 2.5 years ago now. And it's interesting. It's kind of one of those things where like in Buddhism, actually, there's a debate whether you get enlightened all at once or whether it's gradual. So the joke is kind of that it's gradual until it's all at once. And it's kind of how I feel looking back at my work and my path and stuff. It's like it did happen kind of all at once one day, but there also was a slow buildup where I was figuring things out. So yeah, basically now I view myself as, I mean, I never really use this term because it sounds kind of pretentious, I guess, but kind of like a reformed occultist in a way. I really do view myself as someone that was on like a particular path and then I got off of it. And now I'm in Christendom. And that's a huge part of my work, is exploring that and bringing, what I know and what I did into the light of that, and also taking the light of that worldview and bringing it back into all the other things that I'm interested. I guess the other piece of it, not to go on too much about myself, would be that part of that whole world is being into just kind of weird things in general, whether it's like paranormal stuff, maybe even touching on like conspiracy world, or just kind of the whole strange set of odd things that happen in life. So yeah, now I am kind of going back and bringing the worldview I have now into that, and things kind of make a lot more sense. And then my art has always been married to that whole process.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when you talk about the idea of being a reformed occultist or something like that. I really have a theory about that. I know a lot of people that kind of came to Christianity, and more traditional Christianity, even let's say Eastern Orthodoxy or more traditional Catholicism, who actually come out of an occult past, you could say. And my theory about that is that the Christianity became so milquetoast, in the later centuries, let's say towards around 17th, 18th century, it became very materialistic, and Protestantism, but also Counter-Reformation was part of that, the mystical aspect was almost forgotten. It's as if it kind of faded away or was left there, that no one knew what to do with it. And so it was taken up by all these stranger parts. And so what I felt is that people who are looking at the occult, usually their desire is not bad. They want to find something deeper. They want to get a deeper connection. They want to understand, how these patterns manifest themselves. They can see that that's what some of these occult writers are talking about. But sadly, they end up with a kind of piecemeal solution. The occultism is very fragmentary, and it lacks the full metaphysical structure that traditional Christianity offers. And so I've noticed that a lot of those people, when they come back, then they see something like Eastern Orthodoxy, they encounter, the writing of the church fathers and how powerful it is, and how, let's say the little things they got from magic in terms of understanding how ritualized reality is. They notice that communion, that, the liturgical year, the liturgical structure is, it's whatever you learned about magic, it's that times 1,000. It's actually world building. It actually holds reality together. And so it's just interesting to see that you're kind of on a similar path. So are you part of a group? Like, are you in a particular church?
I am not, actually. It's not really, it's actually not by design at all. Really, I guess you could say is that when I first kind of got on board, I decided that I should take some time and just kind of get my own life together and get my head straight. And what I told myself was I was going to focus kind of on my relationship with like God more than trying to pick like a particular group to be with. I think also in the very beginning, like I wouldn't say like you hit rock bottom, but like you hit the wall and you're like, okay, this is not the road to go down. Maybe the theological minutia doesn't matter like as much at that point. But after a year, maybe a little bit more than that, I started to feel like I kind of had to figure it out a little bit. So I've been doing my own like theological investigations and stuff like that. I guess right now where I'm at is I'm more sympathetic to apostolic succession style Christianity, that being like Catholicism and Orthodoxy. But I guess I'm kind of at this point where I can see where everyone's coming from. And it goes back and forth between being like something that's on the front burner for me, where I'm like, all right, I really got to like figure this out. But sometimes I feel like, I actually don't know if you were born into Orthodoxy or not, but I feel like for me, oh, cool. So yeah, for me, it goes back and forth between being like something that is genuinely coming from my like need for spiritual refuge, but then also sometimes, we were just talking about Twitter a minute ago, it does become kind of like an ego aggrandizing exercise. And when I get to that point, I kind of put it on the back burner again, when I'm like, oh, it's my job, like I'm gonna come in and decide this like theological debate from centuries ago, like I'm so important. So I go back and forth. I'm figuring it out slowly, you could say.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a great value in kind of engaging. I talk about this a lot on my channel. It's hard to do because the world is so spectator like. Our whole world is very spectator like, but there is a great value in participative patterns, right? Where you actually engage inside the pattern. And so going to a church, participating in the liturgy, submitting to a priest, like submitting to a spiritual father, all of these gestures make you participate in these symbolic patterns that we notice in the world, So, I mean, I would say, you'll figure it out on your own at some point. You'll slowly kind of find your way, hopefully, into some community. And so we'll trust God to kind of bring you towards whatever ends up being the best for you in that moment.
Yeah, I think it's happening slowly. Yeah, I'm kind of in this weird Venn diagram overlap where like I don't belong to a group, but I'm also not one of those people who's like, yeah, it doesn't matter. It's all kind of the same anyway. So it's always like I feel the need to like clarify a little bit. Yeah.
So the thing that really kind of attracted me to your art was, of course, it's very symbolic in the sense that it's very, you use a lot of imagery that is structured in a way that's very hieratic, that it's like almost like logo-like. It doesn't take realism as its basis. It doesn't take the desire to show, like the shadow of something on something else, or the color, but it's really typified. And so there's a kind of strange, a very interesting mix of graphic art in your work, iconography, Christian iconography, and almost even a graffiti aesthetic, you could say, bringing it also into a knowledge of Western symbolism, and of course also Western esoteric symbolism. So that's kind of one of the questions that I had for you. And it's funny because someone came at me on Twitter because of it, because I was promoting your work on Twitter, and someone came at me and said, oh, he's using occult symbolism, using esoteric symbolism. And I think that I come at it also from the point of view that I mentioned before, which is that I see a lot of the esoteric Christianity that appeared in the West as a desire to explore the deeper aspects of Christianity. Now, they did it in a way that sometimes went totally off the rails, that sometimes is unacceptable. Yes, we can all acknowledge that. But for example, like you use some Rosicrucian symbolism in one of your images, and you had a rose in the center of the cross, and someone was saying, oh, that's Rosicrucian. But okay, so it's Rosicrucian, but are you looking at the symbol? What's wrong with the idea that there's a rose at the center of the cross? It's actually a very powerful image of what the cross is, what creation is, what is at the center of the cross. All of these things are being brought together in a very powerful way. So now, whether or not Rosicrucians exaggerated or went off the rails, or because of their secret society status, they were involved in some kind of weird political movement, that's beyond, well, it's not totally beyond the point, but is it possible for us to take these images back, right? To bring them back and to show their potential to participate in the Christian narrative. So I don't know if it's something you thought about, or if you're going about it more intuitively.
Oh yeah, dude. Yeah, I think about that all the time for sure. It's a big part of my art situation, I guess you could say. Yeah, well, for me, it's always like there's a really, I guess you could say, a fine line where on the one hand, I think of it as like, I never really want to like concede territory to some, let's say, ideologies or worldviews that I'm not really about. Like, that's a perfect example, like rose and the cross together. Like, it is kind of classical, like Christian medieval symbolism, but certain groups have like used it. So sometimes I'm sitting at my desk and I'm like, yeah, well, I'm not going to give up this territory. Like, I'm not never going to use this because of this like group or whatever. But then on the flip side of that, I feel like I do have kind of like a responsibility to not, frankly, make certain things look like really sexy and cool, honestly. I feel like a lot of the kind of like shadowy, amorphous ideology stuff just gets by on its like, frankly, like sex appeal, and because it looks really cool. It's a lot of it is like primarily aesthetic, actually. So yeah, it's always a balance. Like a really good example of that is like astrology stuff. I used to use like astrological glyphs and things like that in my work. And it was never even really about astrology. It was more just about like what it represented in terms of like the zodiac as like a cohesive symbol set. But eventually I stopped because I didn't want to maybe, you know, like I'm saying, give people kind of the wrong idea, or maybe someone would see it and be like, oh yeah, like that is really cool. I should get this book on astrology. And then, you know, I've accidentally like promoted that. So I go back and forth. There's a few good examples. For me, one of the examples I always use is like a pentagram. Like you can go back and make like an academic case like, oh, well, in medieval art, like the pentagram represented, you know, the 5 wounds of Christ. But at the same time, I mean, I think the ship has kind of sailed on that. I'm not going to be like putting pentagrams in my art, you know? So there's like a fine line, you could say. And, yeah.
Well, I've had this argument about pentagrams with a few people where I've tried to show that there is a pentagram structure in several Christian images. The most obvious one is the image of Christ on the throne with the 4 cherubs around him. You have Christ's head at the top, and you have these 4 points, you know, the 4 points of the 4 directions kind of going away from him. So he appears, it's actually exactly a pentagram symbolism, because he is the top point as the head of these 4 manifestations of himself. And so it's like you said, I would never put a straight up pentagram in my images, of course, but I say of course, but I wouldn't, because of the same reason you said. But at the same time, when someone tells me that a pentagram is in itself evil, or that it has in itself some kind of evil meaning that is included in the geometric shape itself, I can't handle that. Like, I just can't accept it. I end up calling it out every time and say, no, a pentagram is a very powerful shape. It has a lot of meaning in it, and there's nothing illegitimate about it. Now, we obviously don't want to be a stumbling stone for people as well, but we have to understand what it is. If understanding what a pentagram is very useful, because you can understand what it means to have something above 4 corners, like to have something that is a top 4 manifestations, right? So the 4 gospels or the 4 directions or something like that. So it can be useful, but I understand. But I see that, like, for example, I noticed that you use the all-seeing eye, like you use the eye, the divine eye, which the same with the rose and the cross is it's an image which precedes any form of Illuminati existence. Like you see it in medieval churches. I had a crazy example recently. There's a church nearby in this small city in Quebec, and in one of the arches of the roof of the church, there was the ceiling of the church, there was an all-seeing eye. And we were doing a tour of the church, and a guy looked at it and said to his friend, he said, "Oh, that means that this is an Illuminati church. And I was like, what? You're completely insane. There's all-seeing eyes in churches all over the world, from the Middle Ages until the modern world. So it's not doesn't mean that Freemasons were involved in building that church.
Yeah, the church there is probably like the least Illuminati place in the city, probably, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like, I don't think there were a lot of Illuminati in French Canadian peasant culture. Like, I'm sure there wasn't a lot of that going on.
Yeah. Yeah, I always think of this story. I honestly wish I could find it. I just remember reading it somewhere, but it was something like these like townspeople were talking about how the full moon is like the time when like the devil's active, and how the full moon is like this evil symbol. And I think it was a saint or some like holy person was like, actually what the devil does is he just chooses to do things when the moon is full, so that you guys associate evil with the full moon, and then this really beautiful thing God made becomes this like perverted symbol of evil. And I really, really like that like little like tale. And that's something else I think about also. Like, an owl is another perfect example. Like, yeah, secret societies using owls, but like at the same time, I mean, God made owls. Am I like never going to put one in my art? Probably not, right?
Well, yeah, no, you're right. Exactly the same. But I think we can also do a service to the world by re-explaining this symbolism in a way that is more powerful than giving them over to the dark side. Like you said, like, if we just let the dark side have this symbolism, then we're actually making ourselves weaker. Rather, if we are able to reclaim it in a way that's legitimate, that's not just random, but we can do it in a way that's legitimate and can help people understand the deeper meaning, then I think we can do it. Like, when you see someone, you see the kind of weird conspiracy side that sometimes that goes off the rails, when they see two pillars and an arch, and they think, as soon as they see two pillars and an arch, all of a sudden it's like, this is like Freemason, or this is evil. Like, dude, you can't do that. Not two pillars totally. And an arch. My goodness. Like, you're basically eliminating all of architecture just with that strange gesture, or that there's a keystone. Like, if they see a keystone, they think, oh, that's Freemason. Like, nah, dude, a keystone is not Freemason. There's actually, when you see that the quote of Christ, when he talks about how the stone that was rejected by the builders became the top of the angle, it's like, it seems like it's referring to something like a keystone or a capstone, rather than just the corner of an angle, because it's misshapen, right? It doesn't have the same shape as the others, and so it ends up being the final stone which holds everything together. So Christ is actually using architectural symbolism to talk about himself. So if you're going to give that to your enemies that you see as your enemies, you're going to give that to them, then you're missing out on something.
Totally. Yeah. I couldn't agree more, honestly.
And so what is because I'm looking at a bunch of images of you that you're doing, and you really seem to be exploring more and more kind of Christian symbolism, and you're using. So you even made an icon of Saint Herman, like a Saint Herman of Alaska. Tell me a bit about what attracts you to Saint Herman.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that's a cool one. Well, yeah, just off the bat, I mean, some people listening to this probably don't know me. I'm not famous yet. Just kidding. But yeah, all my work is Christian for sure. Like, even if I'm just drawing like a flower or something like that, like, I'm doing it like in like a Christian context. So just throwing that out there. Yeah, well, I made this image of St. Herman because, for a few reasons. I guess working backwards, I'm really into Seraphim Rose, who's a really big like influence on me. Partially because, in case people aren't familiar with his work, one of the main inroads for me was he has a book called Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. And even before I ever would have thought about Christianity at all, someone told me this theory that UFOs were related to demonology, and that like UFOs were an extension of, the demonological phenomenon from the past. And that just totally blew my mind. I was really kind of into the paranormal at the time, and I was like, wow, I never would have thought of that. That came from Seraphim Rose. So I read the book, and he's a really cool guy even outside of that. I don't want to pigeonhole him as like the UFO demons guy. And he's associated with St. Herman's Monastery in Alaska. So I started looking into it, and I just thought he was a really cool figure. And I really liked the idea. I mean, I'm American, also, in case people don't know. I just really liked the idea of Christianity coming to America in the most general sense, whether it was Orthodoxy or Catholicism or anything really. And I thought he was a really interesting figure in that context. I'm pretty sure he's this patron, I don't know, I wouldn't say patron saint, but he's like called the wonder worker of the Americas or something in the church. And yeah, I just thought he was a really cool guy. I really liked his life story, which I kind of illustrated like in this image here. And yeah, I just felt kind of a kinship with him, I guess you could say. Not that I'm like similar to him, but I kind of felt an affinity for him. That would be the real word. Yeah.
And the image that really, I guess this is related to what you're talking about, so I'll bring it up, because the image that someone posted and then I saw that really kind of struck me and then got me connected to you was the image of the Mother of God cutting off the alien's head.
Yes. Yeah.
Man,
If I had like a if I had like a greatest hits album, that would definitely, I think the crowds would definitely put that on there for sure.
I love it. And I love the fact that you see like the sea serpent. There are many images in that. There are many things in there where you see the sea serpent getting his head cut in the waters.
Totally. Yeah. This image is actually a really good encapsulation of like what I'm about just in general, honestly. When I drew it, just so also I feel like I should just like qualify a little bit. Like I really do take the creating imagery that would be perceived as religious or spiritual thing like really seriously. So like when I drew this, I wasn't thinking like, oh, this is a picture of Virgin Mary. I just kind of drew it as like a somewhat generic like holy woman. So just so people know, I'm not over here like doodling like, you know, and kind of taking it very flippantly, I guess you could say, like rendering like holy figures and stuff. You could see actually the Saint Herman of Alaska image is like totally different than this one because he's like, you know, a historical person. This is just like a generic figure. So like I should clarify.
Well, I wouldn't say, I would like for sure, I wouldn't say it's an icon, especially in my Orthodox context. Like I don't see this as an icon of the Virgin Mary, but it's obviously a figure which, because you put a crown on top of her head and you put the stars in the heavens, it's the illusions are very strong.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But yeah, this image would be like a really perfect encapsulation of my vibe, honestly. You have this like holy woman like beheading this alien. Over on the left, there's like the angel coming down with like Noah's Ark. I was thinking about the Nephilim and stuff like that. Got this guy getting abducted in the bottom right. I guess, yeah, you could say that part of what I'm about is really like integrating all of these things into a view of the world that is theological, I guess you could say. You know, I was into conspiracies for a long time. Nothing too crazy, just saying. Maybe like, you know, Bigfoot, UFO, nothing too crazy there either. And, you know, little things like that. And then I feel like when I started getting a more theological understanding of the universe, even just little things like, you know, why is evil happen and why are things the way they are? It all becomes integrated in this way. So yeah, pairing the theological imagery with more unexpected things, I guess you could say, is probably a big part of what I'm about.
So the one weird thing about that image, the one which I'm wondering about, and I'll be honest, is just the image of the ladder with the devil like atop the ladder.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So over on the left, there's on the right, there's the guy getting abducted from his house into like the night. And then above that, he's getting led up this ladder and there's like the devil there to like snatch him like at the top of the ladder. And there's also Saturn over there. I kind of like intentionally put that symbolism in.
Yeah.
Basically what it's about is that I felt like there's this whole aspect to the UFO and paranormal thing in general, where I really do feel like part of it is kind of designed to like ensnare people and maybe lead them down these like wrong roads. There's a lot of stories like that. I mean, I could go into it, but there's many stories where someone will get like just obsessed with like particular minutia of alien abduction experiences, or they'll start seeing UFOs everywhere. And often it'll like totally like destroy their life, honestly. Or things like, you know, beings like that kind of leading people into like a weird, like science-y, Gnostic-y, cosmic-y, new age religion worldview. So that's what I was thinking over there. It's like the guy gets abducted and then he's led up this ladder, like to the devil. And I guess it looks a little weird because it's like in the heavens. But what I was thinking was that, you know, in his mind, he's like, oh, I'm going up this ladder, like I'm ascending. But then at the top,
then he has like a surprise, like he has a bad surprise. I can kind of get it. It's just because the ladder, especially in iconography, is associated with like the Jacob's ladder. So like the idea of going up the ladder is usually associated with like coming near God. But because it's almost like you could call it like the false ascent or something, like the ascent of pride is what seems to be represented. But I like the idea of the person getting abducted by aliens and then coming up and realizing that it's the devil.
Yeah, if I did this again now, it would be cool to have like a longer, like more classically like angled ladder on the left side that maybe did like go all the way up to the heavens or something. So it'd be like more of an obvious like comparison.
Yeah,
But
well,
yeah, so
you could like a good way could be to show the flip, because it's almost like a flip. You get abducted into a spaceship, so you're physically going up, like into the spirits of the air or something, and then what's actually happening is you're actually going down the slide, like you're actually sliding down into the mouth of hell. If you look at the images of the Last Judgment, you might get some ideas about that. You see this either like a snake starting at the foot of Christ, going kind of sliding you down into the mouth of hell, or sometimes there's like a ray of fire which comes down from Christ's foot, and then that people kind of ride down into the mouth of the monster.
yeah, I've seen those. It's
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah,
Yeah,
those
it's
are.
actually it's something we kind of touched on just like really quickly before, but yeah, that's one thing that got me hooked into, I guess you could say, sacred art in general, even when I was just kind of starting my path, was the ability to read it and kind of
Mm,
get information out of it was something that I thought was really awesome. I was making images and I was painting, but I'd kind of been more schooled in like a, 16, 17, 1800s, like oil painting kind of aesthetic situation. So then when I started seeing images and I was like, wow, this guy basically wrote a book that I'm looking at and I'm like
mm.
unpacking all of this and it's telling me so much. That really like changed my artistic path forever.
Yeah, I think I had the same experience when I discovered medieval art, and especially the especially that church decorations, because the church decorations, they appear as this like 3D system of imagery that are relating to each other, that are kind of playing off each other, and so it ends up being really like a system of meaning that is manifesting itself to you. That you can. It's a pattern, really, like it's a pattern of it's an algebraic pattern, and so that's what I like about your work. That's what it feels like as well. It's like you have this, you put all these images next to each other, and they create these analogies that bring out the meaning.
Yeah, totally.
Sorry, do you want to say something?
No, I was just gonna say, yeah, I've spent a lot of time like in different. I think that's also part of what I took away from being a part of different kind of like worldviews, I guess you could say, is after you kind of do the whole survey, like every um, worldview, theology, religion, whatever it is, has its sacred art that kind of carries its worldview in it. And that was one of my other main motivations for kind of doing what I do, is that I felt like for our modern culture, there's not really that. There's not really like, oh, here's a clear thing that embodies like our kind of like spiritual experience at this moment. That's how I felt at the time anyway. So yeah, that was something else I wanted to help work on. Yeah.
And so what kind of people do you feel are the ones who are responding to your work right now? Like what's your public like?
That's interesting, man. I feel like I'm in the overlap of a lot of Venn diagrams,
Yeah,
and
that's what
it's
I feel too.
pretty.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's interesting too because you know, I think it's people that, I mean, on the one hand, well, I guess you could say the main kind of core, in my opinion, because this is kind of how I feel and where I come at it from, is that I feel like there's a lot of people who have been like young guys, at least. I don't know if it's just guys, but in my mind, I'm a guy, whatever. Like young guys, maybe who for a while, it's kind of like eventually you wake up to like, wow, like things in society are really unideal. And there's all these like large forces. And like, I'm actually really like maybe angry or not happy with this. And I really
Mm,
don't like it. And I feel like at first you're on the surface level of that. Like maybe there's some like particular political issue you're interested in. And yeah, that's probably important. But then you kind of like go deeper and you untangle all these like webs of these interconnected wires. And I feel like eventually it kind of leads you to like a theological view of things where you're like,
mhm.
oh, there is like good and evil. And it's more than just like things generated in the human mind, you know? So I feel like I get a lot of people like that who are like, yeah, I have some kind of inkling that there's some like theological nature to things. And I feel like, I don't know if I explained it well, but yeah, that's how I feel like it's kind of like the core of people. Um, People who I guess you could say are interested in culture and society and how it's going.
Yeah.
And then that has dovetailed with a theological understanding of the world,
Mm,
because that's me.
yeah.
But then also on top of that, yeah, there's other people who are just into like weird, like what I call like third eye weird stuff, like could be like Bigfoot or UFOs or anything. A lot of people who have maybe been on a similar path to me who are like, yeah, I used to really be really into like psychedelics and stuff, and now I'm like kind of just floating. And then also people who maybe are Christian or have been Christian, but just enjoy seeing like a different embodiment of it, I guess you could say. I get a lot of messages like that.
Mm.
You know, I think that's the other thing is like, I'm very like realistic about who I am and what I do. Like, you know, you mentioned before, like, yeah, I would never like call this an icon. Like, yeah, in my mind, like I'm like on the bottom, I'm like a little pawn on the whole chessboard of like Christian stuff happening. And I'm just a little pawn that makes like my cool, weird images. So yeah, I think some people get a kick out of that. So I think it's a lot of Venn diagrams overlapping.
Yeah, and I often talk about in my work, I talk about the notion of the narthex, or the art of the narthex, and the idea of the bridge art, or the liminal art, right? And so that's when I saw your work, I kind of right away felt like that's one of the roles you seem to play. And when you're discussing the type of people that are interested in your work, it seems to make sense that it would be those kinds of people, you know, because there is an aspect, like you said, to see yourself like at the bottom, using imagery from popular culture and kind of weird culture, but then also connecting it to more formal iconography, is something that would happen at the bottom, or on the edge, or, you know, in a place like the narthex, which is a transition between inside and outside. So you can have, like you said, people coming from psychedelics, coming from all this stuff, and then all of a sudden realizing that, okay, this Christianity, which I always thought was stupid all my life, because all my teachers told me it was stupid, and all culture told me it was stupid, all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, no, there's something else going on here. I don't know how to grasp at it yet. I don't know how to attach myself to it yet. But here's something that here are these types of images that are kind of slowly bringing me towards a fuller understanding, something like that.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. There's this guy I really like named Benoit Mandelbrot. He kind of like popularized, you wouldn't say discovered, but he kind of made like fractals a thing in like science and mathematics. And he has this quote, which is all established fields owe a great debt to those scholars who are nomads by choice. Because that's how he felt. You know, he's not an artist, but all his work is visual. He's not really a scientist because it's more like theoretical math, but he's not really a mathematician because it's all about the natural world, kind of. So I've always really identified with that archetype, where it's like, you know, I'm not a theologian, but I really like theology. I'm not a sociologist, but I'm really into analyzing culture. And I think a lot of people can identify with that, especially now when things are kind of getting more enmeshed than ever.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that your work has that quality to it too. A kind of hybrid monster, hybrid monster work. But there's a place for that. I talk about St. Christopher a lot, and the imagery of the monster as being important, like the gargoyle. All of this stuff is also part of the Christian tradition. We just have to understand its role. Like it's the kind of thing where I always joke about that, because I make T-shirts and I make all this stuff, and I say things like, you know, yeah, I make T-shirts, but if I saw a priest wearing my T-shirt in the altar, like I would physically eject him from the altar. Like things are just have their place, you know. If they're in the right place, then they're fine. It's the same with your images. Like I love the images you're making, but if I saw someone painting an image of that lady decapitating an alien like in the apse of a church, I'd be like, dude, you need to be excommunicated. You know, it's all about place.
Totally. Yeah, definitely.
So I have a question. It's almost like a technical question, but so in your work, there's a little thing that appears a lot, and it's like this square with a triangle in it. And I'm trying to like figure out what its reference. Like there's a version of it on the hand of this holy lady decapitating the alien. You see it. There's an image of a guy in the church.
Nice. Yeah, totally. Yeah, the guy in the church. Yeah, that image. It's called the Amateur Theologian. I like never title my work, but that one has a title.
Nice. I like that. Yeah. Amateur Theologian. That's a great image.
Yeah, I drew this because honestly, like sometimes I'm working in purely like, you know, oh, I want to explore this idea, but I actually drew this because it's like really how I feel and how I felt, especially like at that time, where it's kind of like you're just like some random guy, but like you really want to figure out these like huge theological issues that are like way beyond your comprehension, or like, you know, you're beyond your station in life, let's say. So yeah, I drew this guy and he's almost like anguished, I guess, like screaming out, kind of just because of what I just said. He like knows he's like just this one random guy, but he wants to like figure it out. So yeah, that's really literally how I feel all the time. Yeah, that it's supposed to be like a little gem, like a little like diamond or like a little jewel. That little square thing he's holding. I basically use that for a few reasons. I often have it on, well, I kind of picked it up, I guess you could say. I did this image of St. Augustine. That's probably one of my other most popular images. And I took it from this Renaissance painting of him being coronated, him being like crowned.
Hmm.
And they're crowning him with these white gloves. And on the white gloves is a big gem on the back of the glove. And I just drew it without really thinking much about it. And
Hmm.
someone told me there were these special gloves. Yeah, I think if you search for like coronation of St. Augustine, it's on the Wikipedia page, I'm pretty sure too. Uh, so someone told me there were these gloves they would wear, and the jewel represents like one of the wounds of Christ on his hand. And there would be these like red gems to represent like those wounds basically.
Okay, yeah.
So
So I see that. Yeah.
yeah, so I guess you could say like don't really expect other people to like pick up on it necessarily, but I often use it in that way where it's like this red gem. Red often correlates with like passion and like the passion and like suffering in some way to me. So I kind of thought of it that way. It's like this like redemptive aspect of like suffering in my mind. Again, I wouldn't expect anyone to like pick up on that. But also the gem is kind of an interesting symbol because gems are made deep down in like the hidden parts of the earth where there's like a ton of pressure and all this time and these huge like almost cosmological like geological forces, but they produce these like beautiful wonders that then we have to dig down deep in the earth to get. So obviously it has some like level of symbolism there where like you have to dig down to like find these things that are like hidden in the earth but ultimately are really beautiful because they come from this like dark, weird, inaccessible place.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of like what I think about the gem symbolism.
Yeah, the gem symbolism is important because especially for Christians, it's important because it's exactly what you said. It's related also to fish symbolism, which might sound surprising at first. It's the idea of shiny things in the darkness, right? And so that in the darkness are hiding, that life is hiding in the darkness, and that Christ, one of the roles that Christ has is to go down and to gather the fish, gather what is alive in the dark places. So save us from death, go down into death, take the souls out of death is part of it. But it's also this idea that the seeds are hidden in the world, right? The seeds of meaning, the seeds of, let's say, the hidden presence of God is there in the world if you can dig in and find the hidden gems, right? The
Yeah,
parable
totally.
of the pearl in the field, that the man who sells his field, who buys his field to have the pearl, or all these images of like little things, like small things, the seeds and fish and everything. So yeah, so the gem is perfect in that sense because you, like you said, you actually go down into darkness, into these dark caves, and then you find these glowing things. It's almost as if they brought light down into darkness, right? They're shiny, and so then that ends up being the last image of the world too, is this city which is covered in gems.
Yeah, nice. That's true, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it also makes me think about, like society's relationship to those things because the gem is also, it's almost like money. Like it inherently has like a financial value, but
Yeah.
its deeper symbolism has like nothing to do with that like commodification. So I also sometimes think of it in that way. It's like something that society has taken and been like, oh, hey, this is worth a lot of money, right? But it's like actual value has like nothing to do with that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're totally right. Um, And there's also an interesting tradition about the idea. This is more of a Jewish tradition, but it's interesting to think about that the first tablets that Moses made, when Moses received the tablets from God of the law, that the first tablets, the ones he broke, were made out of like a gem. Because it just says they're stone
Yeah.
tablets. We always imagine the stone tablets as being like granite or something. But the idea that the first tablets would have been gems, and then the second tablets would have been more coarser material, is related to this idea of something coming down, like that has to be brought down lower in order to be seen, but also the idea of raising something from the earth up so that it becomes full of light, like this gems that come up. Also because we facet gems, and so we in order to make them even more resplendent, we have to make them geometric, right? We have to make them into like geometric shapes. So all of that I think the symbolism of gems is really something that I probably should make a video on at some point because it is very fascinating.
Yeah, do it.
So where are you seeing, like, where do you see yourself going? Because you talked about, before we started recording, you talked about how you're almost becoming overwhelmed right now with commissions. And so where do you see yourself going in terms of choosing your projects, going, what direction would you like to go with your art?
Well, yeah, it's kind of the main thing on my mind right now. Well, my setup is I used to live in a really big city, and then for a variety of reasons, I just kind of packed it all up and moved out to kind of the middle of nowhere style. And yeah, I'm really just trying to do my art and have it work both as an outlet for everything we've talked about, but also, I mean, I hate saying it this way, but it's reality of like the world, like kind of like a business, I guess you could say. I have to like have a family and stuff like eventually. So yeah, it's been really interesting, man, because the last year I've basically just been learning how to run my little studio. And I do have like a little studio. It's like a little room that I'm in right now. And just figuring out how to run it and everything, how I want to balance projects. I'm really lucky actually, because there's not really a conflict between what I see as projects that would make the studio functional in terms of like me being able to afford to eat, and then also things that I do want to be doing. I'm really lucky that both of those things have synced up perfectly. I don't really know what I would do otherwise if I had to like fake, stuff that was going to be like commercially like viable, but I'm lucky that I don't. So yeah, I'm basically just figuring out how to run things, man. I really want to start stepping up the caliber of what I'm outputting. I'm kind of at this point where I always think of things in terms of like weaponry analogies, where like I have these like little armies out and all the armies are doing pretty well. So now I'm back in the lab working on like, bigger, more powerful weaponry for them. Comics is something I've been exploring that I feel like I have a lot of like potential on. I made a really long comic about like sex and pornography and my own like experiences with it recently. Some more like weird tale comics also.
In the same style as what you've got going now?
Yeah, it's actually on my website under comics. If you go to my website's owencyclops.com, by the way. That's the plug.
Yeah, there you go.
Under comics, it should be there. Actually, is it there? I can send you the PDF right now. It might not be there yet, actually, but I'll send it to you right now.
Yeah, I'd be interested, just because that's the comics is something that I've been kind of diving into.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
we're working on a comic awesome. Now. I mean, I'm not the artist. It's someone else. But I wrote it with my brother, and so yeah, I'm excited to see. I think the potential of comics is really great for someone who's interested in symbolism, and it's been taken by the dark side, I would say. You've got people like Alan Moore, who's just has such an amazing grasp on laying out of symbolic structures within a page. And so it's like, I just see him as my nemesis or something. Like we need to take that back,
That's what you're shooting for. Nice.
Got to shoot high, because he's really good. He's really good at doing that.
Totally. Yeah. So I sent it to you right now as a PDF. Yeah, the comic thing is something I really like a lot because I enjoy the informational aspect of being an illustrator. That's the other thing also. I really use the term illustrator intentionally because I'm not really a fine artist. Like my work wouldn't be meant to like just hang, like not that anyone would want this, but like to hang in a museum or something like that. I really do make like illustrations where it's meant to be like casually enjoyed in this like other kind of like liminal space. So yeah, the comics thing is really cool for me because I like writing, but I'm not a writer. I would never really sit down and just write a story. But when it's paired with the images, then I really do feel like it's something that I think I'm good at it. Obviously, I do it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of power there. So I made this comic. It's just called Sex. It's about like my kind of history with like sex and pornography and stuff because I thought a lot of like young men could like relate to it.
Yeah.
So totally different than my other stuff, but also oddly like completely related to it. And yeah, one of my plans is I kind of do want to do like a longer like graphic novel like that, where I basically just go through these like particular things that like I've personally like had to deal with that I feel like a lot of like other people have also wrestled with. It also really fits in with like the Christian theology thing because ultimately it's kind of how I ended up there. So that's something that I'm working on. It's kind of like a long-term project. Where basically I'd go through and talk about like sex and drugs and occult and all this stuff and then have it all build up to like me kind of, figuring it out a little bit more.
I think that's a great idea for a story just because it's so relevant to what's happening now. And this moment, let's say, where you have the kind of new atheist type atheism is kind of breaking down. And because that has positive aspects, but also has negative aspects, which people are looking for kind of spiritual sustenance. but then they're looking all around and, not always finding the best, let's say. So that could be a really good story to tell.
Totally. Yeah, it's funny too because honestly, like it's a lot of stuff that I really never thought I would talk about. Like, I'm on Twitter. It's at Owen Broadcast, by the way, other plug.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's not. I never imagined myself to be this guy who's like, hey, by the way, like I used to drink a lot. And, like, here's what that was like. And like, hey, by the way, like I did ayahuasca. Like, because I feel like the psychedelic stuff is something I really never thought I'd end up talking about a lot, because I feel like everyone's been at a party where someone's like, hey, I did ayahuasca and it was crazy, man. And like, I never want to be that guy. But then I go on like my sister's like normie Facebook, and like Vice News is like, hey, do ayahuasca. Lindsay Lohan did ayahuasca. Like, go on The View. They're going to talk about ayahuasca. And I'm like, okay, kind of have to like push back against this a tiny bit.
Yeah. No, I agree, because people in my own circle, people that I admire, have been, let's say, it seems like they seem to be pushing psychedelics as some kind of a solution. And, I've never done psychedelics, so it's not like I can speak out of experience, but I do feel like there's an aspect of the message that's missing, and we need to be careful as people kind of see this as some solution to their problems, that they think that they're going to find it there. There is no chemical solution to your problems in terms of spirituality. That's not possible. That's not how any of this stuff works.
Yeah, I also feel like, I would normally feel, frankly, like arrogant being like, hey, everyone, like, listen to me about this thing. But for me, it's more like there's really no, and this also fits in with like the, Christian worldview, tying in with like how culture's going and stuff. I feel like there's just no pushback against it at all. I think that most people, probably 99% of people, have probably never heard anyone make the statement of like, yeah, I used to do psychedelics a ton, and here's why I think that is not a viable spiritual path. I think that in everyone's mind, it's kind of just this reefer madness thing where it's like, oh, don't take acid, like you'll turn into a glass of orange juice or something. But I think the intelligent case being made against that stuff is almost at zero. And that goes with a lot of other things that I'm not really about anymore. But yeah, it's one of the only reasons why I kind of like started talking about it more, is that I was like, wow, either no one's equipped to push back against it, or no one's doing it, or I just haven't found them yet. But
well, I think that's maybe one of the issues. One of the issues is that, let's say, like in my normie state, in the sense that I'd never done psychedelics, so I don't have the tools to push against it either. I just kind of see it weird. Like I've noticed that a lot of the things one of the things that I have noticed is that despite the fact that people tell me how much insight psychedelics brings them, when I talk to people who've done a lot of psychedelics, I don't necessarily feel like they have more insight. And so, I mean, not to be arrogant, but I just don't see your insight. I see you tell me you have insight, but I don't see you able to communicate that insight somehow to the world around you. So because of that, it's like, I'm like, I don't know, man. I don't want to be, like you said, I want to be that idiot and just say drug bad, don't do drugs. But at the same time, I was like, I haven't seen, let's say, that it necessarily gives something good. It seems to be like a chemical tool, like any other chemical tool.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny. It actually kind of fits with like the whole fool thing that maybe we'll talk about later. But I think that in a lot of cases, it's almost, and this goes with like, frankly, everything that I'm kind of against in like society, honestly, it's a very like emperor new clothes style situation where the lie is kind of like so thick and everyone kind of takes it for granted that it really takes someone who is kind of willing to like maybe even look like an idiot to be like, hey, actually, like everyone's saying that down is up, but have you ever thought about that up is up? And then some people are like, wow, actually, I never really thought about that, actually. And I feel like that about psychedelics. Like honestly, dude, like the whole time that I was in that world with a ton of different people doing it in a ton of different contexts all over, like whatever, I feel like there was almost never anyone who expressed any skepticism whatsoever. And the first time that I had someone be like, hey, have you ever thought about like, maybe this isn't like 100% great? I was like, wow. It's almost why I actually I haven't ever thought about that. Wow. So yeah, it's I love the Emperor New Clothes story, especially now, because that's like really how it is. Like you need a little kid to be like, what if smoking weed literally all the time is bad? And you're like, oh yeah. What if that is bad? Like, So yeah, I'm sure some people are listening and they're like, "What are you talking about?" But people who are in that, people who are in that world,
yeah, it depends.
people who are in that world know what I'm talking about, and I feel obliged to reach out to people that are kind of like in the same tide pool that I used to be in. Let's say. So some people probably are like, "What are you talking about?" But some people are like, "Oh, that's probably true." Actually.
Yeah. All right, so now I want to talk about, because we've been talking for a while, but I do want to talk about the image that we kind of made together. So
Yes.
I've had this theme in my mind where I've been talking about the notion of the fool. My brother as well talks about this quite a bit in his book, The Language of Creation. The idea that the fool is always turning and is always turning things, but the strange thing happens when things are already upside down, when the world is already upside down, is that the fool will continue turning and then will end up reinstating the let's say reinstating authority or reinstating the king. And so I had this idea that of a Joker card, which could have a Joker on one side and a king on the other, and it looks like the Joker was turning the king. And I actually tried to draw it myself, and then I was like, nah, this is not good. Like it's just not the type of image that I'm really that comes close to the art I'm doing. And so it just never looked right. And then when I saw your art, I thought, okay, this guy, he's the one who can put it together. And so you did, and I love it. I just think it's so awesome. So maybe you can tell me a bit about the process you went through to kind of bring this image together.
Nice, cool, man. Well, I'm glad you feel that way. I'm glad I was able to step in that role. And yeah, it was super cool working with you and doing it. Process wise, well, yeah, you told me about that idea, and it's something that I resonated with really strongly. I mean, you take on commission, so I think you probably know there's a spectrum of someone being like, "Hey, can you draw this?" And you're like, "Yeah, I probably could." And then sometimes people are like, "Hey, can you draw this?" And you're like, oh yeah, buddy, I can definitely draw that." So yeah, it's something I resonated with really strongly. I really, the fool archetype is like a big part of like what I'm about for sure. So I guess we can go into that more, but yeah, I really resonated with it. And in terms of the visual, like the purely visual, like purely putting it together like in a visual sense, yeah, I felt like it was perfect for my style because like you were saying before, it's almost like everything in my art is kind of like flat, but in this weird way where it's like flat, but also kind of like has depth. I think I got that from the medieval art where, you know, it's like the picture plane that you're looking at isn't really a window into a three-dimensional space. It's almost utilizing like the flat nature of the surface you're looking at to convey information to the viewer. So yeah, we talked about it a little bit, sent some sketches back and forth. I think the most interesting thing for me was conveying the idea behind it of like the fool really flipping the king over, and we got this like spin with the cards on the back. But yeah,
one of the things I like about it and that we hadn't talked about, because I just said, I'd like the fool to be like kind of grabbing the king and flipping him over. One of the things I like, and I don't even know if you did it on purpose, but you can tell me if you did, but I like the fact that he's not taking the king by the hand, right? He's grabbing him by the arm, and it almost looks like the king is resisting. It's almost looking as if the king is resisting. He doesn't actually want this to happen, but if the fool's like, sorry, buddy, this is happening. Like, order's coming back, even if the king doesn't want it to happen.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, that was definitely intentional. Yeah, when I'm working with, I guess all my work is kind of like this. When I'm working with more of like a simplified, like I keep using this word, but informational way of like conveying visuals, people's body language, even like really subtle aspects of it, is something that I really think about a lot. Probably to an extent that people would probably find like kind of weird. So yeah, I definitely made it intentional because I wanted to make it clear that he was like the leader pulling him. I had this art teacher once, and she did this exercise where she had people line up, and she went to hand someone a pencil, and before she gave them the pencil, she had them freeze. She went to hand someone a ball and had them freeze, hand someone something else and had them freeze. And you could see that their hands, even just the way they were, the frozen people, the way they were positioned, you could tell what object they were about to receive from how their hands were. And that really made me realize that, yeah, like everything about someone's body language, even how their fingers are or anything, conveys like their state and what they're doing and what they're feeling. So yeah, I made it intentional for sure. And it's also, even with the thumb out, it's kind of like he's like pulling, like he's just casually, kind of like authoritatively, like, whoop, here we go, like flipping over. So yeah, that was definitely intentional.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell me a bit about the fool. Why you feel the fool is something that you connect with.
Yeah. Probably for a lot of reasons. On a purely like, I guess not purely surface level, but in the most like basic way, I feel like, you know, tying back to like the Emperor's New Clothes thing, I feel like we're dealing with like a world, whether you're like into politics or just culture or even just theology and religion or just living your life and hanging out. We're kind of dealing with a world where things are so inverted and people get like the wrong idea about what you're saying. And there's all these kind of like informational archetypes launched. Like I'm sure anyone watching this probably has been in a conversation where, you know, you say something and then what the other person hears is like a stereotype of what you're saying, and then they can't actually hear the words that you're trying to get out. And I feel like the Fool is like a really powerful way of like bypassing that. It's almost like the Fool is able to cut through all the rules of like how language and information is meant to be structured in society. And because of that, he can get at these deeper truths without attracting these like, you know, crosshairs onto him. I think that's one of the aspects of a jester. You know, the jester could even like critique the king because he's like, quote unquote, like just joking. And that's something I've always resonated with really strongly the whole time I've been, you know, doing anything like this. Even when I was just posting on Twitter and stuff, you know, I get people DMing me all the time, like, hey, this is really cool, but like, are you joking or not? Like, I can't tell. And I feel like that lets me honestly kind of like get away with a lot of stuff because, you know, if you feel strongly about anything, if you just come out and you're like, oh, I feel, you know, it doesn't really matter what it is. Like, let's say it's gun control. It doesn't matter. If you just make a post that's like, hey, we should all be allowed to own these guns. Everyone's kind of like, okay, like whatever. But if you make it something funny or make it like a joke or maybe like subtly, you know, then it gets a lot more traction and people are more interested in it. And especially if it's something more controversial than that, whatever it would be, you can reach more people if it's kind of like, hey, I'm just joking, but like, am I just joking? Like, you can't really tell. There's this alchemy book. I never read it actually. I just saw it in a bookstore once, but it was called A Serious Joke. And I really just loved that title because it's like, yeah, it's a joke, but what the Fool's saying can also be like serious. There's not actually the dichotomy there that people imagine.
Yeah, well, that's what the people who are using memes right now, those that are using memes almost in a weaponized manner, that's what they understand. You know, all the 4chan, 8chan types, they understand how the use of ironies and double ironies and all of this is a way to, it's like an and it's a way to kind of change the world without people understanding exactly what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. There's also kind of the Fool also dovetails with like certain elements of like mysticism, I guess you could say. Maybe, you know, like there's the Fools for Christ in like Eastern Christianity. And then in Western Christianity, there's also the kind of like the mystical fool archetype.
Well, Saint Francis is really that. I mean, he's usually not. People don't seem to see it that way, but Saint Francis does all the things that the fool does. Like he undresses himself in public. He does all kinds of crazy stuff. You know, so he's definitely a fool type as well.
Totally. Yeah, I also feel like when we live in this world that is such like a I don't even know what to call it, almost like a cult of like this particular type of like intellectualism where it's like you have these like intellectual authorities that kind of like are telling you what to think, I guess would be the most basic way to put it. The Fool has like a really interesting role to play in all that, I guess you could say. Yeah.
No, the Fool is undermining. That's the rule of the Fool. And so sometimes it's dangerous, right? Sometimes it can be if it goes too far in one direction, sometimes it can be a destabilizing force. In small doses, it's actually healthy because, like you said, it prevents the king from puffing himself up or thinking that he's self-sufficient, right? At some point, the authority thinks that they've got it covered when the Fool is there to say, you know what, this thing that you're hiding here, you know, this secret that you've got is not, is showing that there's a piece, there's some stones lacking in your Tower of Babel, you know? And so that Fool is useful for that as well. But I'm really, for now, at least, I'm really interested rather in how, because the revolutionary types, those that were there to destabilize society to a certain extent, because they've become so powerful and they've actually taken over a lot of the institutions, then the Fool in that role now all of a sudden looks very strange because the Fool is actually trying to take power away from those that were trying to be revolutionary. And so it's just interesting because it really does show this strange double irony where it's like, what happens when contemporary art, you know, let's say in terms of just art, into why art, which is there supposedly to be transgressive, is now in the Guggenheim all over the world, and there are these multi-million-dollar buildings and are being propped up by the institutions. Like, what is going on? How is it possible that something which is supposed to be questioning authority is now taken up by the highest authority? Well, that's when the fool all of a sudden, becomes a very strange figure, because the fool is bringing back iconography. Like in your case, you're like bringing back iconography using almost like a subversive language, which is still there, but it's pointing towards something else. And that's one of the reasons why I like your work too, because I could see that double flip that I talk about, or this double inversion where, someone who is using imagery that looks subversive at first glance. Like when I look at your work at first glance, it looks like graffiti, or it looks like, kind of weird esoteric stuff. But as soon as you do a double glance, you see, oh no, there's something else going on. It's actually pointing towards something else. So.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad you feel that way. Yeah, that's something else I kind of picked up that I guess really actually does fit with the fool archetype. Someone I really liked, I mean, I still like him, he's still cool, is Bill Watterson, the guy that did Calvin and Hobbes.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually talked about kind of what you were just getting at a little bit, where because it's like, quote unquote, like just a newspaper comic and people aren't expecting something deep from it, when he did do a comic about like, maybe like a bird dying or something like that, he could kind of just like sneak in like a big punch and get at these like way deeper themes because, oh, it's like just a comic. It's just this like little thing. It's kind of like the fool, like, oh, I'm just playing around. And then boom, you like sneak in something that otherwise people would have like a ton of filters up for.
Yeah. And it acts as almost like a Zen koan, right? It actually goes really deep and will like it can shock your worldview in a way that you weren't prepared for, right? That you weren't guarding for, let's say. And so, it can have a very deep effect. I totally agree.
Yeah, that was the other thing that I really responded to about your initial kind of like our discussion about it, was like the idea of, what happens when things are already inverted and you have this figure that inverts things. It's actually like a really interesting like paradox. I guess that's kind of what I was getting at with like the cult of like intellectualism, I guess you could say, because we're kind of in this position where like, things are so much about like having the right view and trusting like the right authorities and stuff, that I feel like the fool plays into that in an interesting way too, because it's almost like we're in this position where like the smartest questions you could ask will sound to most people like the dumbest questions you could ask. And I feel like that's kind of like a big part of like how I got led down this road and everything, like we're all like so confident in all this like, scientific explanations for the universe. But then you're like, yeah, but like where'd the first like living thing come from? And it sounds like kind of a dumb question, but it's not really. Or like, yeah, why are there like all these things around? Or, I always think of Isaac Newton, for example, kind of a bridge between like esoterica and science, like the classic like tale of him like sitting under a tree and then being like, yeah, wait, why do apples like fall down? Like, what's up with that? I feel there's some fool energy there of just asking like the dumbest question possible. Yeah. And then it leads you to,
changing the world, basically. In his case, changing the whole world.
Yeah, totally.
All right, man. I think we've had a great conversation. I tend to have these go for an hour. We've been going even more. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how people are going to react to this image we did together.
Yeah, totally.
So people write down your comments, your ideas in the comment section. We can see what you think, and who knows, it could lead to maybe some more collaborations. That could be fun.
Totally, man. Yeah, we should stay on each other's radar. I'm definitely down. We could talk more or whatever. I think we have an interesting we have certain overlaps, certain things that are different. So yeah, I really enjoyed talking to you, man. It was super interesting.
Yeah, thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
Hope you enjoyed my discussion with Owen Cyclops. Make sure to check out the image we made together on my Teespring account and see if it's something you would be interested in getting. This is really a collaboration we did together, and so for each t-shirt or merch item that is sold, part of the profits goes directly to Owen as well. So everybody, thanks for your attention, and I will see you soon.